The morning fog hung low over the abandoned industrial district as Ray stepped out of his rescue vehicle, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. He pulled his jacket tighter against the cold October air, his breath forming small clouds in front of him. As a rescue hunter with 15 years of experience at the local Animal Protection Unit, he thought he'd seen it all. But something about this morning felt different. The old factory stood like sleeping giants around him, their broken windows staring down like empty eyes. Ray had gotten a tip from a local worker about strange noises in this area, and his gut told him to check it out. He'd learned to trust those instincts over the years. They'd led him to countless animals in need. Walking between the buildings, Ray noticed how quiet everything was. Usually, there'd be at least some street cats running around or birds calling to each other. But today, there was nothing, just silence. He pulled out his flashlight, even though it was morning. The shadows between the buildings were deep enough to hide anything. The beam of light swept across old metal drums, scattered pieces of paper, and tangles of weeds pushing through the cracked concrete. Ray was about to move on to another section when he heard it, a soft sound, barely more than a whisper. He froze, listening hard. There it was again, a weak whimper coming from behind an old oak tree that somehow managed to grow in this concrete jungle. His heart started beating faster as he approached the tree. Through the morning mist, he could make out a shape huddled against the trunk. Ray had rescued hundreds of animals before, but nothing prepared him for what he saw next. A dog, tied so tightly to the tree that it could barely move, was looking up at him with eyes that seemed to hold all the sadness in the world. The sight hit Ray like a punch to the gut. The dog, a beautiful German Shepherd mix, was in terrible shape. Its golden brown fur was matted with dirt and what looked like oil from the nearby containers. The rope around its body had dug into its skin, leaving angry marks that told the story of days, maybe even weeks of imprisonment. But what struck Ray the most wasn't the physical condition of the dog, it was its eyes. Deep brown and incredibly intelligent, they watched his every move without fear or aggression. Most dogs in this situation would be terrified or defensive, but this one seemed different. There was something in those eyes that Ray couldn't quite explain, a kind of wisdom and, surprisingly, hope. He knelt down slowly, keeping his movements calm and steady. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, letting the dog get used to his voice. "You've been through quite something, haven't you?" The dog's tail moved slightly, just a tiny wag, but it was enough to show Ray that despite everything, this dog's spirit wasn't broken. Reaching into his pocket, Ray pulled out some treats he always carried with him. He held one out in his open palm, letting the dog make the choice. Without hesitation, the dog gently took the treat, its manners impeccable even in such dire circumstances. This wasn't a stray or an unwanted pet. This dog had been loved once, trained well. As Ray began to document the scene with his phone camera, standard procedure for rescue cases, he talked quietly to the dog, explaining everything he was doing. "Just need to get some pictures, pal. Then we'll get you out of here." The dog watched him with those intelligent eyes, as if understanding every word. The morning sun was starting to burn through the fog now, casting long shadows across the ground. Ray could see more details of the dog's condition in the better light, and his heart ached. The rope wasn't just carelessly tied, it was deliberately knotted in a way that made it impossible for the dog to escape. Someone had meant for this dog to stay here, hidden away in this forgotten corner of the city. "Who did this to you?" Ray whispered, more to himself than the dog. He'd dealt with animal cruelty cases before, but this one felt different. There was something about this dog, about this whole situation, that told him this wasn't a simple case of abandonment. This was part of a bigger story, one that he was determined to uncover. Looking at his watch, Ray realized he'd been there for almost an hour. Time seemed to stop in moments like these, when every second could mean the difference between life and death for an animal in need. He knew what he had to do next, but first, he made a promise, both to himself and to the dog watching him with those trusting eyes. "We're going to figure this out," he said firmly, reaching out to gently stroke the dog's head. "And whoever did this to you, they're going to answer for it. That's a promise." The dog leaned into his touch, and in that moment, Ray knew this case would change not just this dog's life, but his own as well. Getting closer to the trapped dog wasn't as simple as Ray first thought. Years of rescue work had taught him that even the gentlest animals could become unpredictable when scared or hurt. He needed to be careful, not just for his own safety, but to avoid frightening the dog even more. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming the cold air slightly. Ray could see his rescue van parked in the distance, its white paint standing out against the gray buildings. He knew he had everything he needed in there: blankets, water, a medical kit. But first, he had to gain this dog's complete trust. "All right, buddy," he said softly, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Let's get to know each other a bit better." He settled down on the ground, still keeping a safe distance. The concrete was cold and uncomfortable, but Ray didn't mind. He'd sat in worse places during his rescues. What mattered was getting down to the dog's level, showing it that he wasn't a threat. As he sat there, Ray took in more details about the dog's condition. Its ridge showed through its dirty coat, but the muscle underneath suggested this had once been a strong, well-cared-for animal. The dog's paws were raw from trying to escape, yet there was still a dignity in the way it held itself, like a soldier standing at attention despite its wounds. Ray reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his water bottle. The dog's eyes followed his movements, its ears perking up slightly at the sound of water sloshing inside the bottle. "You must be thirsty," Ray said, pouring some water into his cut hand. He held it out, waiting patiently. After a moment's hesitation, the dog stretched its neck as far as the ropes would allow and lapped at the water. Ray's heart broke a little more as he realized how desperately thirsty the poor animal was. He poured more water, talking quietly the whole time. "That's it, nice and easy. There's plenty more where that came from." Between sips, the dog kept watching Ray, and he could swear there was a story in those eyes. This wasn't just any abandoned pet. There was something special about this dog. The way it responded to his voice, how it stayed calm despite its situation. Ray had worked with enough service and therapy dogs to recognize the signs of professional training. "You're a special one, aren't you?" he murmured, studying the dog's face. Despite the dirt and exhaustion, there was an intelligence there that couldn't be hidden. The dog tilted its head slightly at his words, and Ray couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, you understand more than most, don't you?" Slowly, carefully, Ray began to edge closer. He kept his movements deliberate and smooth, still talking in that calm, steady voice. He told the dog about his morning, about the tip that led him here, about the breakfast he'd skipped because he wanted to check this place out. It didn't matter what he said. It was the tone that counted, the constant gentle reminder that he was there to help. The dog's tail, which had been still, began to move slightly. Not quite a wag. It was too weak for that, but a clear sign of growing trust. Ray smiled again. "That's right, we're going to be friends, you and me. But first, we need to get you out of this mess." He was close enough now to see the intricate knots in the rope. Someone had spent time on this, making sure the dog couldn't escape. The thought made Ray's jaw clench, but he kept his voice light and friendly. Getting angry wouldn't help the dog right now. There would be time later to deal with whoever had done this. "Okay, buddy," he said, reaching into his pocket for his phone. "I need to make a quick call, get some help here." "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." He dialed the clinic he always worked with, keeping his eyes on the dog as he explained the situation. The dog watched him the whole time, as if understanding that plans were being made for its rescue. While he waited for backup to arrive, Ray started planning how they would free the dog. The rope was tight, and cutting it would have to be done carefully to avoid hurting the animal. But before any of that could happen, he needed to make sure the dog was comfortable with being touched. Slowly, he held out his hand, palm up, letting the dog sniff it. "What do you say? Ready to trust me a little more?" The dog stretched forward again, this time touching Ray's hand with its nose. The touch was gentle, almost polite, and Ray felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't going to be just another rescue. This was the beginning of something important. In the distance, he could hear the sound of another vehicle approaching. Help was on the way. Ray looked into the dog's eyes again and made another promise. "You're going to be okay. Whatever happened to you, whatever brought you here, that's all in the past now. We're going to write a new story, you and me." The dog's tail moved again, a bit stronger this time, and Ray knew right then that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. Sometimes, in his line of work, you just knew when a rescue was going to be different. This was one of those times. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of the veterinary team. Ray didn't take his eyes off the dog as he raised his hand to wave them over. He'd been talking softly to the animal for what felt like hours, building a fragile bridge of trust that he couldn't risk breaking now. "Help's here, buddy," he said quietly. "These are good people, just like me. They're going to help us get you out of here." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of car doors closing, but its eyes stayed locked on Ray's face, as if he had become an anchor in this uncertain moment. The vet, a kind-faced woman Ray had worked with for years, approached slowly. She carried her medical bag in one hand, moving with the careful grace that came from years of handling scared animals. "What do we have?" she asked softly, kneeling down beside Ray. "German Shepherd mix, probably been here for days," Ray replied, keeping his voice low and calm. "No water, no food. The rope's pretty tight, but he's staying remarkably calm." He didn't mention the intelligence he saw in the dog's eyes, the sense that this was no ordinary stray. That was something the vet would have to see for herself. Together, they began the delicate process of examining the rope. The vet's assistant brought over a large blanket and some supplies, setting them within easy reach. Everything had to be done carefully. One wrong move could spook the dog or, worse, cause more injury. "The rope's cutting into his skin in some places," the vet observed, her professional tone not quite hiding her anger at the situation. "We'll need to be very careful. I want to give him something for the pain before we start cutting." Ray nodded, still maintaining eye contact with the dog. "You hear that, boy? The doctor's going to help make it hurt less." The dog's tail moved slightly, that same gentle movement that seemed to show understanding. The vet noticed it too, raising her eyebrows in surprise. As she prepared the injection, Ray kept talking, his voice becoming a steady stream of reassurance. He told the dog about the warm blankets waiting in the van, about the comfortable bed and good food that would come soon. The dog listened, somehow seeming to understand that better things were ahead. The injection went smoothly. The dog barely flinched, as if knowing it was necessary. While they waited for the pain medication to take effect, Ray noticed something else about the rope. "Look at these knots," he said to the vet. "Someone took time with these. This wasn't just abandonment. This was deliberate." The vet's face darkened, but she kept her movements gentle as she examined the knots. "We'll document everything," she promised. "But first, let's get him free." Finally, it was time to cut the rope. Ray's hands were steady as he held the special cutting tool, designed to slip under tight bindings without hurting the animal. The dog watched the process with an almost unnatural calmness, as if it knew exactly what was happening. "Almost there," Ray murmured as the first strands began to give way. "Just a little longer." With each cut, he could feel the rope's grip loosening. The dog stayed perfectly still, showing remarkable patience even as freedom got closer. When the last rope fell away, everyone held their breath. Sometimes this was the most dangerous moment, when a frightened animal suddenly found itself free. But this dog did something that left them all amazed. Instead of bolting or cowering, it slowly leaned against Ray's leg, as if too weak to stand alone, but trusting enough to ask for help. The simple gesture hit Ray hard. In all his years of rescue work, he'd never seen such immediate trust from an abused animal. He placed his hand gently on the dog's head, feeling the warmth there, the life that refused to give up despite everything. "Let's get you checked out properly," the vet said, already pulling out her stethoscope. The initial examination would happen right there. The dog was too weak to walk to the van, and they needed to make sure it was stable enough to transport. As they worked, the morning sun finally broke through completely, warming the cold ground. The dog's fur, despite its matted condition, caught the light in a way that hinted at its former glory. Ray could imagine how beautiful this animal had once been, and with proper care would be again. That's when Ray made a decision that would change everything. He'd fostered many animals before, helped them recover and find new homes. But as he watched this dog submit to the vet's examination with gentle dignity, he knew this case would be different. "I'm taking him home," he said quietly to the vet. She looked up, surprised but not disapproving. "He needs more than just medical care. He needs—" Ray struggled to find the right words. "He needs someone who understands what he's been through." The dog's tail wagged again, stronger this time, as if approving the plan. The vet smiled, seeing the same special connection that Ray had felt from the beginning. "I think," she said, "that's exactly what he needs." As they prepared to move the dog to the van, Ray felt a deep certainty that this rescue wasn't just about saving an animal's life. Somehow, this morning had set something bigger in motion. This dog, with its wise eyes and unbroken spirit, was about to change not just Ray's life, but the lives of everyone it would meet. The veterinary clinic was quiet except for the gentle hum of equipment and soft footsteps of staff moving around. Ray sat in the examination room, watching as the vet carefully cleaned the mud and oil from the German Shepherd's coat. The dog remained remarkably calm, only occasionally turning its head to make sure Ray was still there. "You're doing great, buddy," Ray said softly, noticing how the dog's ears perked up at his voice. Even after everything it had been through, the animal showed an incredible ability to trust. The vet worked methodically, revealing more of the dog's true coat color with each gentle wipe. "Look at this," the vet said suddenly, her hands pausing in their work. "There's something here." She parted the thick fur around the dog's shoulder blade, revealing a small raised area under the skin. Ray leaned in closer, hope rising in his chest. Could it be? "A microchip," the vet confirmed, already reaching for the scanner. This tiny piece of technology could be the key to unlocking the mystery of where this dog came from, who it belonged to, and how it ended up tied to that tree. The scanner beeped as it passed over the area. Numbers appeared on the small screen, and the vet quickly typed them into her computer. Ray held his breath, wondering what they would discover. Sometimes microchips led nowhere, batteries died, information became outdated, or owners never registered them properly. But this time was different. The computer pinged with a match, and both Ray and the vet leaned forward to read the information. What they saw made them exchange shocked looks. "This can't be right," Ray said, reading the screen again. According to the registry, the dog's name was Thunder, and he had been reported missing 3 years ago, from a town more than 200 miles away. The registered owner was listed as Mrs. Chen, but there was a note on the file marking her as deceased. "Wait," the vet said, clicking through more information. "There's more." She pulled up additional details that made the story even more extraordinary. Thunder hadn't been just any pet. He had been a certified therapy dog, specially trained to work with veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress. Ray looked at Thunder with new understanding. This explained so much: the unusual calmness, the intelligence in his eyes, the way he seemed to read human emotions so well. "You're a long way from home, aren't you, boy?" he said softly. Thunder met his gaze steadily, as if relieved that part of his story was finally known. The vet continued reading through Thunder's medical history. He was in perfect health when he disappeared. Mrs. Chen reported him missing after she was hospitalized. The vet paused, her voice softening. She passed away 2 weeks later. Ray felt his throat tighten. He could imagine how devastating it must have been for Mrs. Chen to lose her companion during her final days. But what happened after that? How did Thunder end up tied to a tree in an abandoned industrial park so far from home? As the vet continued her examination, more of Thunder's story began to emerge through his physical condition. The rope marks weren't the only signs of neglect. There were older scars that suggested he'd been kept in poor conditions for a long time. But despite everything, his basic training was still intact. He responded to simple commands, showed impeccable manners, and maintained the gentle demeanor that made therapy dogs so special. "His weight is dangerously low," the vet reported, making notes in her file. "But his heart is strong, and there's no sign of organ damage. With proper care, he should make a full recovery." She looked at Ray meaningfully. "He'll need a safe place to heal." Ray nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. Thunder needed more than just medical care. He needed someone who would understand his background, respect his training, and help him reconnect with his purpose in life. "I have a spare room that would make a perfect recovery space," Ray said, watching as Thunder's tail wagged slightly at his voice. "It's quiet, away from the street." He didn't need to finish. The vet was already smiling and reaching for the adoption paperwork. As they waited for the papers to be processed, Ray sat on the floor next to the examination table where Thunder rested. The dog's eyes were getting heavy. The day's events and the medication were finally catching up with him. But he kept shifting his head to keep Ray in sight, as if afraid his new friend might disappear. "You don't have to worry anymore," Ray assured him, gently stroking his head. We're going to figure this out together. Someone out there knows what happened to you after Mrs. Chen died, and we're going to find them." Thunder sighed deeply, finally allowing his eyes to close completely. In the quiet of the examination room, Ray made another promise, not just to Thunder, but to the memory of Mrs. Chen as well. This special dog would have a purpose again. Whatever darkness had filled the past 3 years, the future would be brighter. The vet returned with the paperwork, her face showing the same mix of sadness and hope that Ray felt. "It's not often we get to solve a mystery like this," she said quietly, watching Thunder sleep. "But something tells me this is just the beginning of the story." Ray signed the papers, making his commitment official. As he did, he couldn't help but think about all the questions that still needed answers. Who had taken Thunder after Mrs. Chen's death? How had he ended up so far from home? And most importantly, who had tied him to that tree, leaving him to die? The answers would come in time. For now, what mattered most was that Thunder was safe, his true identity was known, and he had a chance at a new life. Sometimes, Ray reflected, the most important rescues weren't just about saving an animal's life. They were about restoring their dignity, their purpose, and their ability to trust. The following days turned into a mission of discovery as Ray dove deep into Thunder's past. His dining room table became command central, covered with papers, photos, and notes. Each new piece of information painted a clearer picture of the remarkable dog sleeping peacefully in the corner on his new bed. Ray started his investigation by reaching out to the Veterans Hospital where Mrs. Chen had worked. The phone call revealed more than he expected. The receptionist remembered Thunder well. Apparently, he had been something of a celebrity there. "Oh, Thunder," the receptionist exclaimed when Ray explained who he was calling about. "He was amazing with our veterans. Mrs. Chen would bring him in 3 times a week. You should have seen how people's faces lit up when he walked into a room. We were all heartbroken when he disappeared." Ray scribbled notes as she spoke, his coffee growing cold beside him. Thunder lifted his head at the sound of his name, those intelligent eyes watching Ray work. The more Ray learned, the more extraordinary Thunder's story became. Mrs. Chen had adopted Thunder from a specialized training program that prepared dogs to work with veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress. The program's director still had Thunder's training records, which she eagerly shared with Ray. "He was one of our best graduates," she explained over the phone. "Incredibly intuitive. He could sense when someone was about to have an anxiety attack before it happened. We were devastated when we heard he'd gone missing." Ray looked at Thunder as he listened. The dog had moved closer to his chair, as if understanding they were talking about him. Despite everything he'd been through, that special awareness was still there. Just yesterday, Thunder had gently pressed against Ray's leg moments before his phone rang with some difficult news about a failed rescue. It wasn't a coincidence. Thunder was still doing what he'd been trained to do. The investigation took an interesting turn when Ray received an email from a former janitor at the Veterans Hospital. The man remembered seeing something strange the day Thunder disappeared. He had noticed a van in the parking lot, someone talking to Mrs. Chen. She had seemed upset. "I didn't think much of it at the time," the janitor wrote. "But a few days later, when I heard Thunder was missing and Mrs. Chen was in the hospital, I wondered if there was a connection." Ray printed the email, adding it to his growing collection of evidence. He was starting to piece together a timeline. Mrs. Chen had fallen ill suddenly, ending up in the hospital. Thunder had disappeared around the same time. But who had taken him? And why? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ray had posted Thunder's story on several missing pet forums, including pictures of how they'd found him. A pet store owner from a town about 50 miles away recognized the distinctive rope pattern used to tie Thunder to the tree. "I remember selling that type of rope to a guy who ran a backyard breeding operation," the store owner said when Ray called to follow up. "He was always talking about how he could make good money breeding specialty dogs, said he just needed to get his hands on the right bloodlines." Ray's hands tightened on his phone as he listened. The story was becoming clearer, and it made his blood boil. Someone had seen Thunder, recognized his value as a highly trained therapy dog, and decided to profit from it. They must have taken advantage of Mrs. Chen's illness, somehow getting hold of Thunder when she couldn't protect him. But something had gone wrong with their plan. Maybe Thunder was too old for their breeding program, or maybe his gentle, trained nature made him unsuitable for what they wanted. Instead of doing the right thing and turning him into a shelter, they'd simply abandoned him, leaving him to die tied to that tree. Ray spent hours making calls to local animal control officers, building a case. Thunder stayed by his side the whole time, occasionally resting his head on Ray's knee when the conversations became intense. It was as if he knew Ray needed the comfort, just like he used to do for the veterans at the hospital. The investigation wasn't just about finding who had hurt Thunder, it was about making sure they couldn't do this to any other animals. Ray documented everything meticulously, building a file that would help law enforcement track down the backyard breeding operation. As evening fell, Ray finally put down his phone and looked at the papers spread across his table. The story they told was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Thunder had gone from being a beloved therapy dog to a victim of greed, but his spirit had remained unbroken. Even after years of misuse and neglect, he still wanted to help people. Thunder got up from his bed and came to sit beside Ray's chair, letting out a small whine. Ray checked the time and smiled. It was dinner time, and Thunder never forgot schedules. Some things, like his training and his caring nature, were simply part of who he was. "You know what, buddy?" Ray said, reaching down to scratch behind Thunder's ears. "We're going to make sure your story helps other dogs. And maybe," he paused, an idea forming, "maybe it's time you got back to doing what you do best." Thunder's tail wagged, and his eyes seemed to brighten. He understood far more than most people would believe. As Ray got up to prepare their dinner, he knew that solving the mystery of Thunder's past was just the beginning. The real story would be what they did with the future. The weeks passed like pages turning in a book, each day bringing small but significant changes in Thunder's recovery. Ray watched with joy as his rescued companion gradually transformed from the frightened, weak dog they'd found tied to that tree into something closer to the proud therapy dog he'd once been. The physical changes were the easiest to see. Under the vet's careful guidance and Ray's attentive care, Thunder's coat regained its shine, thick and healthy where rope burns had once marked his skin. His ribs no longer showed through his fur, and his eyes sparkled with renewed energy. But it was the emotional healing that truly amazed Ray. One morning, as Ray worked at his desk filing reports from other rescue cases, he heard a sound from the kitchen. Thunder had managed to open the cabinet under the sink, something Ray hadn't even known he could do, and was carefully pulling out the recycling bin, piece by piece. "What are you doing, buddy?" Ray asked, walking into the kitchen. Thunder looked up at him, tail wagging, and then pointedly looked at the calendar hanging on the wall. Ray followed his gaze and suddenly understood it was recycling day. Somehow, Thunder had remembered the schedule and was trying to help with the household chores. "You're something else, you know that?" Ray said, grinning as he helped Thunder finish the task. It was moments like these that showed how much of Thunder's training and intelligence had survived his ordeal. He wasn't just recovering, he was remembering who he was meant to be. The breakthrough moment came unexpectedly during one of their evening walks. They passed the local community center where a group of elderly veterans gathered for their weekly coffee meetup. One of the men was sitting alone on a bench outside, his hands shaking as he stared into space. Before Ray could react, Thunder gently pulled on his leash, leading him toward the bench. The dog's body language had changed completely. He was now in full therapy dog mode, something Ray had only read about in his records, but never seen in person. Thunder approached the man slowly, carefully placing his head on the veteran's knee. The man startled slightly, then looked down. His hands stopped shaking as he automatically reached to pet Thunder's head. "Well, hello there," the man said softly, some of the tension leaving his face. Thunder stayed perfectly still, letting the man pat him, offering the kind of quiet comfort that no human could quite manage. Ray watched in amazement as Thunder worked his magic. The dog seemed to know exactly what the man needed, when to stay still, when to press closer, when to back off slightly. It was like watching an artist at work, except Thunder's art was healing. After a few minutes, another veteran came out of the community center. "Hey, you okay out here?" he called to his friend. The man looked up, and for the first time since they'd approached, he smiled. "I'm doing better now, thanks to this fellow," he said, scratching Thunder behind the ears. "Reminds me of a therapy dog we used to have at the VA hospital where I got treatment. They just know, you know? They just know what you need." Ray's heart swelled with pride and purpose. This was it. This was what Thunder needed. not just to heal himself, but to return to his life's work of helping others. That evening, Ray made some phone calls. The local veterans center was interested in having a therapy dog visit. The senior living community down the street had a program for animal visitors. Even the children's library was looking for dogs to help kids practice their reading. Thunder seemed to sense that something exciting was happening. He sat beside Ray's desk as the plans came together, his tail wagging every time Ray mentioned words like visit and help. The next few days were filled with preparations. Thunder needed to be recertified as a therapy dog, but the training program director who'd helped with the investigation was more than happy to fast-track the process. She came to evaluate Thunder herself, tears in her eyes as she watched him perform the tasks he'd learned so many years ago. "It's like riding a bike for him," she said, watching Thunder demonstrate perfect patience with a dropped treat. All of this was locked inside him, just waiting for the right moment to come back out. Ray also prepared himself, learning everything he could about working with the therapy dog. He read books about animal-assisted therapy, joined online groups for therapy dog handlers, and talked to everyone he could find who had experience in the field. The changes in Thunder were remarkable. Each day, he seemed to stand a little taller, his eyes a little brighter. The haunted look that had lingered from his time on the streets was fading, replaced by the dignified expression of a dog who knew his purpose. Even at home, Thunder's therapy dog instincts showed through. He seemed to know when Ray had a rough day at work, choosing those moments to bring his favorite toy over or simply lean against Ray's leg. It was as if the dog was saying, "I've got this. Let me help." One evening, as they sat together on the back porch watching the sunset, Ray reflected on how far they'd come. Thunder had gone from a victim of cruelty to a symbol of resilience, from a lost soul to a healer rediscovering his calling. "You know what, Thunder?" Ray said softly, running his hand through the dog's now healthy fur. "I thought I was rescuing you that day, but sometimes I wonder if you weren't sent to rescue all of us." Thunder looked up at him with those wise eyes, and Ray could swear he saw understanding there. This wasn't just a story of healing, it was a story of purpose found, of coming full circle. Together, they were about to start a new chapter, one that would touch more lives than either of them could imagine. 6 months had passed since that cold morning when Ray found Thunder tied to a tree. Now they stood together in front of a crowd at the local animal welfare fundraiser, their story touching hearts and opening minds about the power of second chances. The community center's main hall was packed with people, all eyes on the stage where Ray stood with Thunder sitting calmly beside him. The German Shepherd's coat gleamed under the lights, no trace remaining of the neglected dog he'd once been. But it wasn't just his appearance that had changed. Thunder carried himself with the quiet confidence of a dog who knew his worth. "When I first found Thunder," Ray began, his hand resting gently on the dog's head, "he was in the worst condition I'd seen in my 15 years of rescue work. But even then, tied to that tree and barely able to stand, there was something special about him. Something in his eyes that told me he hadn't given up." The audience listened intently as Ray shared their journey, the discovery of Thunder's past as a therapy dog, the investigation that revealed the truth about his disappearance, and the remarkable way he'd reclaimed his purpose in life. Thunder watched the crowd with those same wise eyes that had caught Ray's attention months ago, seemingly understanding the importance of their story. "But this isn't just about one dog's rescue," Ray continued. "It's about what happens when we refuse to let cruelty have the final word." Thunder could have emerged from his ordeal angry or afraid. Instead, he chose to keep helping others. As if on cue, Thunder stood up and walked to the edge of the stage, where an elderly veteran sat in the front row. The man had been one of Thunder's first therapy visits after his recertification, and their bond had grown strong over the months. Thunder gently placed his head on the man's knee, drawing smiles from the crowd. "That right there," Ray said, his voice thick with emotion, "is what this is all about. Thunder doesn't just visit the Veterans Center now, he's become a symbol of hope there. The folks he works with don't just see a therapy dog. They see someone who understands struggle, who knows what it means to fight your way back." The presentation screen behind them showed photos of Thunder's work over the past months, sitting with children as they practiced reading aloud, visiting seniors in the retirement community, working with veterans at the local VA center. Each image told a story of connection and healing. "We also started a new program," Ray explained, clicking to the next slide. Using Thunder's story, we're helping raise awareness about backyard breeding operations and animal abuse. But more than that, we're showing people the extraordinary capacity animals have to forgive and to heal. The screen showed pictures of Thunder working with other rescued dogs, helping them learn to trust again. His gentle presence had a calming effect on the most traumatized animals, as if he could tell them, "I've been where you are. It gets better." Last week, Ray continued, we received news that the people responsible for Thunder's abandonment were finally caught. Their breeding operation was shut down, and dozens of dogs were rescued. And you know what Thunder did? He visited those rescued dogs, showing them that a different life was possible. The audience murmured in appreciation as Ray shared how the investigation they'd started had led to a larger criminal case, ultimately helping not just Thunder, but countless other animals. But perhaps the most amazing part of the story, Ray said, calling Thunder back to his side, is how it's inspired others to take action. Since we shared Thunder's story, local shelter adoptions have increased by 40%. People are reporting suspicious breeding operations. The community is watching out for animals in a way they never did before.